Okay, it's time we settled this once and for all. Was there really an African samurai in feudal Japan? And we shall observe how this video game has exposed a very modern phenomenon where history is fought over fiercely and small details which seem to be set in stone in the past, 500 years ago or so, are in fact heavily disputed and have huge consequences for today. So even a very minor figure of history like the one we will discuss has thousands of people arguing about how the past should be represented in popular media. So in case you've missed it, there's been uproar in the past few weeks as Ubisoft, the maker of the Assassin's Creed franchise, announced that their latest game, Assassin's Creed Shadows, was going to have a protagonist who is an African samurai. So following the announcement, there was floods of criticism that went Ubisoft's way. They were accused of all sorts of things, accused of being politically correct, accused of being ahistorical, accused of outright fabricating history. But now the dust has settled, we've all calmed down a bit, we can calmly and dispassionately look at the history. Was there actually an African samurai? Was the decision a good one to make the protagonist of this game a man named Yasuke or Yasuke? I mean, I've seen different pronunciations of the man himself. Was it right to cast this man as the protagonist of Assassin's Creed? So for those of you who don't know, each Assassin's Creed game is set in a different era of history, and the joy of the game for many people is the ability to interact with the history of surrounding them in the game. Even though it is itself fictional, you will meet real life people, you will be in real life settings that all occurred in the past, and it's incredibly educational and fun to play. So the first game was set amidst the background of the Crusades. The second game, arguably the best one, was set in Renaissance Italy, where you play as Ezio Auditore, a real fan favourite, and get to experience the machinations of Italian politics at that time amongst the beautiful backdrop of Italian cities like Venice and Florence. And it is for this reason that there has been much excitement and much demand in the Assassin's Creed fanbase for many years for a game set in feudal Japan. And Ubisoft had seemingly given the fans what they wanted, creating a game set in 16th century Japan. But what was the background of Japan at that time? The world that Yasuke would step into. Japan of the late 16th century was a nation in turmoil. This was known as the Sengoku Jidai period, or the Age of Warring States, and it was a time of relentless warfare, political intrigue, and social upheaval. Central authority had completely collapsed, and powerful feudal lords known as daimyos vied for supremacy over a fragmented nation. So this was also a time of great technological change in the land of the rising sun, as Japan had begun to trade with the West for the first time. All sorts of exotic goods were brought over by the Portuguese on their famous black ships. And speaking of ships, today's sponsor is World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval combat game on PC that puts you as the captain of over 650 historical ships which are spread across 13 different nations. I joined World of Warships as they set up a station at Armed Forces Day as part of the 80th anniversary commemoration of D-Day. Visitors that day had a wide range of options available to them. They could play the game and be in with a chance to win great prizes. They could enjoy a fascinating talk about the history of D-Day from one of the speakers. That's me, by the way. And if that wasn't enough, the day itself featured parades by those currently serving in the armed forces and those veterans who served in times gone by. There was an exciting parachute drop into the event, and visitors had the chance to witness the spectacular skills of the Red Arrows as they performed death-defying stunts in the sky. Download the game at the link in the description, and once you register, use code DDAY80th and you'll receive a huge starter pack worth €25. And it was on a Western ship that the African Yasuke arrived in Japan and his story truly begins. Now, before we go over this man's biography, it's important to highlight just what a battle there has been over every little detail of this man's life. And look no further than the Wikipedia page if you want to see this. Ever since this controversy started around a month ago, there has been edit after edit after edit on this man's page. I mean, it more resembles trench warfare than it does a historical source or a point of information for people. And I truly believe it's a feature of our era where a video game can launch an almighty brawl over a historical figure who until a few months ago most people hadn't even heard of, but now they're scrapping like crazy over the smallest details of his life. Now, in many ways, I'm happy about this because people are taking a very specific interest in history, but it goes to show that how we understand the past and how we interpret it in the present is constantly in dispute and constantly evolving, and people will be forever arguing about such things. So the online discourse around Yasuke has centered on a few key questions. Firstly, and perhaps most fundamentally, did he even exist? Some people are saying he wasn't a historical figure, as in fact based on myth and folklore. Secondly, what was his track record as a warrior? Who did he fight for? Where did he fight? When did he fight? And finally, and perhaps the most disputed case of all, was he a samurai? And the back and forth between him being a samurai, him being a retainer, has been the center of this battle for history. Now, the first question is the most simple to answer, but that's where the easy work ends. Yasuke did exist. He is a recorded historical figure from multiple sources. However, there aren't many sources. His life is not well documented at all. Information is so scarce we don't even know his original name. He is thought to have originated from Mozambique in East Africa. However, other people suggest it was from Ethiopia. He arrived in Japan in 1579 with the Jesuits, in the service of the missionary Alessandro Valignano. Now, Yasuke would go to Kyoto with the Jesuits, and he was described as being great in height. And understandably, 16th century Japanese people had never seen anyone like him before, so there was overwhelming curiosity when this giant African walked through the streets. And it's even said that they had to break down the door to get into a Jesuit church because they were so eager to see him. Which makes us hope that he isn't a stealth character in the Assassin's Creed game, because even by the standards of historical fiction, a dark-skinned giant man is not going to be able to blend in 16th century feudal Japan. And it was at this point that Yasuke caught the attention of one of the most powerful figures in Japan at this time, the daimyo Oda Nobunaga. Now, Oda Nobunaga was a very forward-thinking and outward-looking man. He actively encouraged trade between Japan and the outside world, and was fascinated by Western technologies and methods. He encouraged the Jesuits to set up their presence in Japan, and eagerly introduced gunpowder weapons into his armies, purchasing matchlock muskets from the Portuguese. And he was no different when it came to Yasuke. Like the Japanese people in Kyoto, he was also fascinated by this exotic foreigner. Impressed by his size and strength, he took him into his service. It was Nobunaga who gave him the name that we all know him by, Yasuke. But the key question is, did he make him a samurai? Despite all the certainty surrounding this debate, the disappointing answer for people on both sides is, we don't really know for sure. A YouTuber I much admire, Metatron, makes a video about this, where he goes through the different pieces of evidence that suggest Yasuke was a samurai, but also the ones that suggest he wasn't. Now, Metatron points out that the word samurai is not used to describe Yasuke. However, that does not necessarily mean that he didn't possess the title of samurai, to do with the different words that were used for different types of Japanese warrior at the time, given the term samurai only came into common use in documents at a later period than when Yasuke lived. Now, there are also sources that say that Yasuke received a stipend, a household, and a short katana from Noda Nobunaga. Now, this perhaps does suggest he was a samurai. However, once again, it's not certain. To complicate things even further, we do know that Yasuke was a warrior, and that he fought alongside his master in his campaign against the Takeda clan. Although it was exceptionally rare, it was not unheard of for foreigners to become a samurai. The most famous case is perhaps that of the Englishman William Adams. Now, Adams was made a samurai by the man who would become the shogun of Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu. So it's certainly not inconceivable that this was in fact the status that Oda Nobunaga had bestowed on Yasuke, and he was more than a mere retainer. However, we have an incident which makes us seriously question whether he held the status of samurai. In 1582, Oda Nobunaga suffers a terrible betrayal at the hands of his vassal Akechi Mitsuhide. Now, Mitsuhide attacks him whilst his guard is down. Nobunaga is forced to commit seppuku. Yasuke is later captured, and crucially is not forced to commit seppuku by Mitsuhide, and is instead released. Now, the fact he was released and not also forced to commit seppuku suggests that he perhaps wasn't a samurai. But even this is complicated, as others have suggested that the reason Mitsuhide did not force him to commit seppuku is because he personally didn't view a black man as a samurai, even if he rightfully was one. So even then, the question is still open. And this is where Yasuke's story ends. He is returned to the Jesuits and continues in their service. He vanishes from the history books. The time span of his story in Japan is only 3 years, from 1579 to 1582. We don't know anything else about his life after this point, or even how long he lived. So was he a samurai? Was he a retainer? It's personal preference at the end of the day, because we don't know for sure, and we don't have many sources on Yasuke's life, as I mentioned. So you have to decide which pieces of evidence carry the most weight, and how they should be understood in the context of the time. which I appreciate is far more subtle a debate than the internet wants to have over the latest Assassin's Creed game. Now, there is something to note about Yasuke's selection as the main character. The main character in other Assassin's Creed games, like Assassin's Creed 2, where you have a game set in Italy with a main character who is an Italian aristocrat. Assassin's Creed Unity, you have a game set in revolutionary France, and you have a Frenchman as the main character. Assassin's Creed Syndicate, two characters, Jacob and Evie Fry, both British characters set in London. Whereas Yasuke bucks this trend, as whether you agree he was a samurai or not, he certainly wasn't Japanese, although it is worth noting that the other female protagonist in the game is Japanese. Also, Ubisoft made a bold decision with his selection for another reason. This is the first time a real-life historical figure has been the protagonist for the game. In all the others, it's been a fictional character moving alongside real-life historical figures who are the side characters. And so given their choice to go with a real-life person, many have been questioning, was this the best real-life figure to pick for the character? Because the Sengoku Jidai period was absolutely replete with incredible and fascinating warriors who could have been picked instead. And many of those warriors are far more well documented than Yasuke is. My own personal view is that he shouldn't have been the protagonist, but would have made a fascinating side character who perhaps could have been made playable for a couple of missions or so. But what do you think? Despite all the fierce debate around the historical side of Yasuke, many people have said that they're excited to play as an African warrior in feudal Japan, and the game looks interesting, even if it is massively overpriced. So comment below, do you think Yasuke was a samurai? Do you think that he was the right choice for the main character? Or even comment whether it bothers you at all. Maybe this is all just a sideshow for you, and as long as the game is fun and is interesting and you can learn something and enjoy it, none of this matters at all. I always want to hear what you've got to say. A very special thanks goes to my wonderful patrons. Their names are on the screen right now. If you'd like to join them, click on the link below. And please like, subscribe, share this video, comment, give a sacrifice to the god of the algorithm. And that is it for now. You've been watching History Revealed, and I will see you on the next one.